So in most cases, it's impossible to test the whole population, and the whole point of statistics usually is to try and infer the population's response through testing a subset of the population called the sample, and therefore sampling is taking that subset and using them to test maybe whatever hypothesis you have or to know whatever data you want and infer the population um, mean value, for example. So this is obviously done to save resources and because it's nearly impossible to test the whole population. And of course, to get a higher quality of data as opposed to when you're doing some sort of faulty sampling or a non-statistically determined sampling scheme. Okay, so representation means that you are uh, representing, so to speak, the population with your sample size, no? Kaya dyan may ding-dong. Yung ganyang kalaki bang ratio ng mixed size ng mixed nuts ay kaya nang i-represent yung actual ratio in a larger bag or maybe a sack of mixed nuts, no? Parang ganon. Okay, when you have resources are of course limited parate and you want to use them as efficiently as possible. So sometimes parang kung ito lang yung pera mo, yung taong kaya mong i-pool for this work, baka hanggang dito lang yung kaya mong sample size kasi kulang ka na ng pera or ng manpower or time to do. So it goes without saying the more variable your population is, or the less homogeneous your population is, rather, the larger your sample size should be. Na para makita natin na so let's say in this case ethnicity for example is a factor in your study, then of course you want to make sure that your um, sample size covers the or reflects rather the proportion of ethnicities in a certain population. So if our sample size refers to the number of panelists that need to be recruited, this is also somewhat dependent on the measurement system or the type of sensory evaluation method you're using. For example, if you're using trained panelists, those that can act like equipment in terms of more or less how accurate they are at describing the level of intensity of tastes and odors, then you need a small sample size like mga 10, 15. However, if you're using consumers, because of the erraticness of their um, responses, and also the fact that consumers usually, as a subset of the whole population, would require a much larger number, then you're looking at a number in the hundreds or so. But usually sa sensory, ang consumer test hindi naman lumalagpas ng 300 individuals, no? So for the most part, since this is an introductory course to undergraduate sensory evaluation, we'll use the recommended rules of thumb, but no, bear in mind, of course, na when you're computing for sample size in relating population responses to sample responses, then generally the more individuals you recruit, the better. But that would also depend on the degree of confidence required and the amount of statistical power you need. You want to use sample selection methods that would have the least effect on the difference between the population and the sample, no? So in that case, usually you want to use probability sampling or random sampling. Kasi kapag nag-random sampling ka, there's an equal chance for each individual in the population to be chosen as part of the sample. And usually we do this using any randomization method. So when we have simple random sampling, as in yun lang, para ka lang pumitik at pumulot, no? So for example, if you have uh, if your population is the classroom of 30 students and you want to choose at random, say, 5 of them to participate in a survey, then meron kang class list tapos either may student number sila and class number, and then you just choose randomly from those class numbers. Similarly, we can also use random sampling when, say, you are doing production line checks. No? Basta ka lang kukuha at whatever interval. Say for a 1 hour run, you need 5 samples. So, pipili ka ng random times within that 1 hour run and get those 5 samples from the production line. On the other hand, when we have systematic random sampling, you spread out the selection process para hindi naman maging halos adjacent yung mga samples mo. Na for example, kung yung sa classroom mo ay naka-arrange yung students alphabetically, di-divide mo siya into, let's say, how many sections na parang, sige, kung 5 yan, merong 1 from class numbers 1 to 5, 1 to 6, 1 from class numbers 7 to 12, and so on. Or for halimbawa, kung yan ay isang isang production plant, no, kukuha ka ng 5 samples within 1 hour, you will divide that into the first 12 minutes until for each 12-minute blocks, you will get 1 sample para sure ka na medyo kalat yung samples na makuha mo to represent the whole 1 hour. Okay? So in stratified random sampling, you divide the population into strata. Now, for example, yung sa classroom mo, you want to account for income brackets. And you can, and kailangan proportional dun sa strata yung number of samples mo relative to the population. So, kung halimbawa, 50% of the class is under low income, 30% is under a medium income, and 20% is high income. So, kailangan ganun din yung proportion to more or less yung number of samples na kukunin mo. So, in cluster sampling, you want to look at those clusters na pre-identified mo, usually nga geographical groups. And from each cluster, you can now select whatever method yung gagawin mo within the cluster, but it should be the same for each cluster. And for example, you want to look at consumer acceptance of a certain beverage, and then gusto mong i-cluster siya based on region, no? Kasi halimbawa, malaman mo pala sa data mo na different regions have different levels of acceptability for this beverage. Actually, sabi nga nila, I think it's in Japan daw, depending on what part on Japan you are in, magkaiba daw yung level ng saltiness or yung pinakatimpla ng instant noodles for this certain brand. That is because they found out that there are apparent clusters in Japan na kung saan yung taste nila sa ibang region ay magkaiba. No? So that could be the reason why you want to use clustering in product development and sensory evaluation. So whenever you have a sampling method wherein hindi pantay-pantay yung pagkakataon na mapili yung each individual in the population, then that would fall under non-probability sampling. And obviously, mas may error kang mapupulot mula dito kasi it's not really random, totally random to begin with. Although mas madali siya kasi kung halimbawa nationwide yung scale ng project ninyo, less demanding siya dun sa kailangan mong resources like money or transport, etc. However, you can not generalize as much from the population. Typically, yung mga nangyayari sa sensory evaluation would be more or less like this kasi hindi naman sa lahat ng pagkakataon ay kaya mong may enough resources ka to do it totally random or totally stratified. Lalo na kung halimbawa gusto mong mag-generalize sa isang ang population mo is um, a whole city like Quezon City, ang laki na nun, di ba? Hindi naman pwedeng kung saan-saan ka mapapadpad, yung testing location mo, iisa lang. For convenience sampling, so similar to non-probability sampling, yung mga disadvantages niya. Okay. Um, in short, sa sensor evaluation, madalas ganito yung nangyayari kasi since voluntary siya, within that population you are looking at, only those who are willing can be taken in. And then, of course, minsan short notice pa. Like for a typical sensory evaluation, mag-a-announce kayo within the college or within the university. Tapos kung ang slots nyo halimbawa ay 30 lang kasi yun lang yung budget ninyo sa class, first come first serve yan, na first 30 na makapila, sila na yung nandun. Paano kung yung karamihan doon magkakaibigan na nagkayayaan lang kasi ayaw pumunta mag-isa, no? So, then there is that sort of problem na hindi na siya totally representative of the whatever population you are considering. That is a limitation of your study as well. Typically, even in journal published studies, meron mga evaluation na yung kinuha lang is yung sa loob ng facility or building nila, employees ng company, or yung nearby places, no? So, yun. Pero mahirap kasi talaga na totally random. Like, call someone and then, can you come here to participate in our evaluation? They'd probably not do it unless your incentive is big enough, in which case, bias na rin yan. So, quota sampling is similar to stratified sampling, except that in stratified sampling, may element siya ng random sampling within the strata. Sa quota sampling, more or less, wala. Parang siguro convenience sampling ang dating, pero meron ka lang characteristics. So, why would you want to use quota sampling? In this case, for example, you'd want to, sabihin natin nagpapa-sensory ka sa school, no? Sa HE, tapos gusto mong kumuha ng per year level na response for some reason. Okay, I don't know kung ano hypothesis mo kung ba't ganun, pero sige. Then, halimbawa, you want 10 from each year level to make up your 50. So, may 50 year and above kasi na category, halimbawa. So, kapag halimbawa, nakasampung freshman na quota na sa freshman, hindi na po kami tatanggap ng freshman na magsisensory. So, parang ganun yung dating niya. As opposed to stratified na pipili pa rin kayo ng 10 freshmen out of the whole population na mag-evaluate. Dito, parang unahan pa rin, pero sige, nakasampu na kami, so bawal na freshmen. Right? So at least compared to the convenience sampling, for example, at least ito, meron kang some sort of representation. Halimbawa sa US, napaka-important ngayon yan na dapat represented yung mga blacks, yung mga Hispanics in everything. Even in sensory evaluation, kasi that would reveal halimbawa yung sa marketing na meron palang discrepancies sa mga gustong taste and flavor profile based on race, no? Na syempre, kapag ikaw ay lumaki sa Mexican food versus sa Asian food versus sa burgers and fries, iba yung perception mo na anong gusto mo sa isang type of product, no? So usually we would want to use this sort of quota or stratified sampling for those purposes. So typically, snowballing naman is mas ginagamit siya kapag qualitative yung research mo, like you want to interview individuals. Okay, kasi hindi ka naman pwede minsan mag-interview lang randomly, no? So, minsan, parang investigador ka, you start with a lead, lalo na kung ang kailangan mo is very specific, like consumers na vegan. Halimbawa, yung research mo has to deal with that. And you want to ask those na malawak ang kaalaman sa veganism, halimbawa. So, you'd look for people, start with the person A, tapos, you now make contacts with others, no? Like, sige, si person A, ni-refer niya si person B, si person B, ni-refer niya si person C, and so on. So, obviously, kapag nag-snowballing ka, hindi na talaga ito per se representative ng population unless the population in question is something like, ang criteria mo mga vegans na more than 5 years na in their lifestyle, parang gano'n, no? So, at least gano'n, mas madali. But again, this is mostly for qualitative work. Kasi hindi mo naman masyadong gagamitin ito just to recruit panelists for any sort of quantified, primarily quantitative sensory evaluation. You probably won't use this for that.